So here we are, we have to talk again about what responses are appropriate. I've had a lot of people asking me for response to the murder of 17 people, 14 students and 3 administrators as I'm recording this in Florida. Guys, I hate to even have to talk about this, but we have waited long enough. The 72-hour window has elapsed. And so lessons learned. What do we do? How do we kind of categorize this? What are the facts? What do we know? And what do we do about it? So first of all, a reminder. I followed the 72-hour rule for a reason. I will put a card up and a link in the description so that you can watch the 72-hour rule and the video that I explain why I follow the 72-hour rule. And that's for my emotional health, your emotional health, and America's emotional health. Everybody wants to lash out emotionally. But there's a reason when officers are involved in shootings that they are given at least 2 sleep cycles before they make a statement. And that is for the grief cycle to process, and so then they can categorize things and think clearly about them rather than thinking emotionally. See, of course, with this stuff, and it makes perfect sense, great emotion gets attached to these events in our own soul, and therefore we attach our ideas to our emotions, and those are the hard ones to get through. You know, we say that people make decisions emotionally and then they justify them logically. And I don't want you to do that. I want you to process the emotion, allow the grief cycle to happen, and then think about what do we know and what do we do. The other part of that is there's so much misinformation for the first day at least, because there's going to be all kinds of speculation, all kinds of discussion. This happened, that happened, this is what's true, this is what went down. When in reality, we don't know any of that stuff. Now, at 3 days out, we have a pretty good picture of some of what went down. We understand what kind of some of the truths are, so then we can start to draw inferences and some conclusions from that and then think about a path forward. So right at the outset, I'm going to tell you that I have some very personal stuff to say here. There is some real personal connection that I have to this that I think is going to surprise you. I will talk about it kind of a little bit later. I got some other things I want to get to first, but understand this is an incredibly personal topic to me, and so I'm going to just reiterate that I ask everybody to be respectful in their discussion on this topic. One of my priorities is I have read a ton of studies from criminal psychologists and profilers and those who understand mass murders, and one of the big things that they do is they study what these people and why these people act the way they do. And one of the biggest reasons they do is for the notoriety. And therefore, one of the first things that I can say that you will never hear from me is you will never hear the name of a mass murderer. You will never hear the name of somebody who goes on a rampage. I just won't name them. So I will work around that because I don't want to feed into their need and desire to be famous. You will never hear me talk about that. The victims for sure, the first responders for sure, those who are there and doing good for sure, but never the murderer, never to give him, you will never see his face on my channel, you'll never see his name, so that we don't feed future problems, and that's something I think we can all do. So let's talk about what we do know about the case. We do know that this young adult, 19 years old, had legally bought an AR-15, and we know that he had had dozens of contacts with law enforcement, that he was adopted as a young child, that his adopted dad died of a heart attack when he was young, and that his adopted mom, who of course that's just mom and dad to him. I'm a child of adoption, and my adopted dad is just dad to me. He's not my adopted dad or stepdad or any of that stuff. He's just dad. So this young man's mom and dad both had died. Dad when he was young, mom from a couple of things, pneumonia, but maybe complications from the flu last year. This kid had this murderer, long history of contact with law enforcement. 39, I think, is one of the news stories. I'm going to put all the news stories I have in the description. You can read them and get all the specifics. But multiple times, neighbors and mom had called the cops many times because he was disturbed. He definitely was under psychiatric care, had visited the psychiatric hospital, had all kinds of known behavioral problems at school, was actually suspended from school multiple times and then expelled from the school for aggressive behavior and for disciplinary problems a year previously. His ex-girlfriend still went to the school. There's some speculation right now, I don't have definitive on this, that that his biggest motive was to cause havoc for his ex-girlfriend and her new boyfriend. Again, I don't have specifics on that, but that's the current thing. That's the greatest that they know. So we know this young man had an incredibly troubled past. We also know that in January, that somebody had called the FBI tip line and had said, this young man has guns, this young man is planning murders, this young man is a threat to everyone around him, and that tip was not followed up with appropriately, so therefore the FBI field office in Florida was not notified, so they did not follow up with this young man who at 19 years old was an adult and was basically out of the system and did not have any support network, was staying with the family of a guy who he knew from high school. So basically on his own, basically no family, had a known history of making threats, had a known history of significant problems, and therefore that day was preventable. We also know that what he did is that he took an AR-15 rifle and went into the school deliberately right at the time that people were getting out, pulled the fire alarm to get more people out into the hallways and out of the classrooms, and then the current count murdered 14 of the students that are there, not classmates. He was gone a year before, but 14 students and 3 faculty members, including one of the unarmed security who was there, who was also one of the football coaches who died valiantly saving students' lives. And so that's something to definitely be aware of. So particularly Coach Aaron Faze, I think, should be lauded as a hero and given a hero's burial and remembered as a hero. And so hats off to him. And of course, we're grieving for him, for his whole family, and for the victims, all the victims who are still hurting. So of course, this one is going to talk a lot about firearms. We know that the murderer actually bought his AR-15 legally. In Florida, he went through a full 4473 background check, and actually Florida even has a waiting period. So he bought the gun and then waited a week and came back and picked it up later and then held on to it, owned it for a year before he used it. I do want to say that there were some reports that he was involved in a white nationalist militia. However, most current thing that I have says that that's not the case, that was a case of mistaken identity, that there was some speculation about that, but that there's no evidence that they have of that is actual solid evidence to date. So we're going to take that off the table. If you've heard that, there is no proof to that I've been able to find. So of course, whenever this stuff happens, folks want to talk about what do we do? And on a statistical outlier like this, sometimes you just recognize there's just nothing you can do. Unless you live in a police state and unless you live in honest to God slavery, then you really can't prevent some of these kinds of things from happening. And of course, everybody talks past each other. So one of the things that I want you to think about is having a meaningful clash. So my friends who are all about firearms rights are talking about their side, and of course they're the only ones who have any truth. And my friends who are about gun control, that's their thing, and we have to do something. And these folks over here, well, here's what we should do. And they're like, what are you, crazy? You love guns more than children, and you want to keep our kids unsafe. And talking past each other like that's not going to help. That's it. It's not going to help. So what we have to do is we have to start with an area of agreement, and then from there build where our differences are from the area of agreement. Now let us say that I think that everybody can agree that we want our children to be able to go to school in a safe environment, that they do not worry and they don't have to be victimized for being in school, that children are not at risk of being murdered in school. And that's what we all want. We all want our children to be safe. We all also want to live in a free society. Those two things are the bedrock here, that we want to live in a society where we are free to live our lives and where we are safe from random violence, as safe as we can be. Can we all agree to that? Now, of course, we have different ideas as to how to be safe and how to live in a free society and be as safe as we can and have that freedom. Those are where our differences lie. But never think for a minute that what we're talking about here is one person loves guns and the other person loves kids, or one person loves families and loves freedom and the other people hate freedom and want a police state. Those aren't helpful. So what we're trying to figure out is what's the best way forward. Here's the reality, friends. I did say this after Las Vegas as well, that that the AR-15 rifle is the most popular rifle in America. It is the most widely sold rifle in America. There's about 5 million of them in private hands. And you know, what we just saw after Las Vegas is a couple of states banned bump stocks. And they said, turn all your bump stocks in, and less than 10% of people did. So 90% rate of failure to comply. And I just can't think that there would be any better than that if the federal government somehow, rescinded the Second Amendment, and the Supreme Court said you don't have any right to have the most popular rifle in America. So again, restricting a commonly owned firearm is just going to be incredibly difficult, would require a repeal of the Second Amendment, Convention of the States, 37 states ratifying a constitutional amendment. That's just not going to happen. Even if it did, 10% of people would comply, and you'd still have millions and millions and millions of these rifles that'll last decades to 100 years or more in private hands. And therefore, I just think that even talking about that, you can say, well, if he wasn't able to buy one, so we could prevent future ones because they couldn't buy him again. Maybe, but again, what's to keep him from making a fertilizer bomb? Or, it would have been no different for him to have used a handgun that he bought from a private party or acquired illegally. Wouldn't have been significantly different if he was using a lever action rifle. If he'd have grabbed a couple of lever guns that had a 15-round capacity in the tube, some 357 lever guns, and just went to town with them and had them New York reloaded because he had his bag to do that, wouldn't have been significantly different. There were a bunch of shots fired, but again, blaming the tool doesn't, I don't think, lead to good solutions. I get it that that's a feel-good, that makes me say, oh, look, I've done something, but it probably won't stop things like this in the future. You also got to recognize that as bad as these are, they're incredible statistical outliers. So about 1% of murders or less in America every year are in these kinds of environments. And so, more people die every year of obesity, more people die every year of car accidents, more people die every year of opium overdoses and opiates. So knee-jerking to take away the freedom from a bunch of people probably won't solve any problems. It won't make anybody safer, and the cure is probably worse than the disease. So what I'm about to say, and what I think the path forward is, and how I think we should focus, is very, very personal to me. I told you I had some personal things in here, but people aren't going to like it. Okay, so the earlier things about AR-15s and whatever, restricting access to guns, is going to make my left friends frustrated. This will probably make my right friends frustrated, okay? Because we really want to demonize this young man. We want to say, hey, he was evil and therefore he did these things. But I'm going to be real with you, okay? I have people in my family who deal with mental illness, and I have looked into the eyes of somebody who I love desperately, who had homicidal thoughts, okay? Who has had voices in their head. The murderer said that he had voices in his head that day telling him to go and kill. And I know because I've looked into the eyes of a teenage kid who had those thoughts because of chemical imbalances in their brain, and the ability to not do anything about it was very difficult. Now, thankfully, in my family's instance, we care and we love, and so therefore we went and got the help that's necessary, and the inpatient care and the psychiatric care and the counseling care, and we're doing much, much better. But put yourself in the place of this kid, okay? God only knows what he got from his birth parents, what genetic soup he got and what genetic mess he got. There's some evidence that he might be on the autism spectrum, but at any rate, the PTSD from the problems of his brain not functioning right and the anger that causes. Then he gets adopted, hopefully by a great family, but adoption is always full of trauma. Adoption is always difficult for everybody. And then his dad dies young, when he's maybe 8 or 10 years old. He's got somebody who loves him, but then he dies, so he grows up without a dad. And then he loses his mom, and he doesn't have great coping skills because he has mental illness and because he's got problems and because his brain just makes pain for him that he can't deal with, and that causes PTSD. And so he doesn't learn to cope well, and he doesn't have great systems around him to support him and help him. And that just makes everything worse. And that makes him unstable, and that makes everybody look around him like this guy's crazy, because he is, because he's got those problems, but there's really no good solutions. And the cops get called, but the police officers aren't mental health professionals, and he hasn't broken any laws, and so they watch him, but they don't have any real way to do anything for him. And then he gets to be an adult, And mom can't make him do anything anymore, so he's not getting any of the help he needs, and he's not taking his medication, and he's not going to counseling like he needs to, and then mom dies. And you have just an absolute miasma of a perfect storm for him to commit this kind of atrocity. Now, I think that we can say that the huge failure here was that the FBI didn't follow up with this young man. He had guns. He had a known disposition to hurt people. He had many contacts with law enforcement officers. And I think the FBI should be ashamed of itself for that failure, because this one could have been prevented. But I do think we need to look long and hard at our mental health care as a nation, at the way that we treat people, at the way that we get people help. And I think it's time for us in America to really think about how do we help people with due process? And I think due process is incredibly important. I am a huge fan of my whole Bill of Rights. But how do we respect due process and at the same time, whether temporarily or longer term as necessary, take away firearms rights from those who are a known danger to themselves or a danger to others? I don't think the answer to that is what California has done, where anybody can swear out an affidavit and they can just go and immediately take things away from you. I think that can be abused, and that's not due process. But if we have a known thing like this, to work through due process and to have a temporary process as well as a longer term process that, say, again, if the FBI has contact and says, listen here, Your Honor, here's what's going on, and then they get a warrant to go and to commit that person, and to say, look, you need to go get some help right now and get an intake, a full psychiatric evaluation, and in that interim going before the judge and saying, here's all these things that we see, and we want a temporary injunction to safely store their firearms, so then that way they're not a danger to themselves or others. And then a full psychiatric evaluation that then starts to get them some help that says, are they no longer a danger to themselves or a danger to others? Are they no longer in a place where they have any kind of those risk factors? And as soon as the psychiatrists and the psychologists say, yeah, I don't see danger to self and danger to others here in this particular instance, then their rights are fully restored. Do we need that? Yeah, we need it. Even more than that, do we need to take seriously mental health in our nation? We do. I'm going to be real with you. If I have one more person that looks at me and says that they think that the psychiatric drugs, that the SSRIs were the problem, I'm going to lose it, okay? Because the causation versus correlation logical fallacy there drives me insane. Okay, there are literally millions of people that are taking antidepressants, that are taking psychotropics, that are taking a medication that helps them to function every day. And those people are not violent, and that vast majority of them are not. And in fact, I would argue that the high likelihood is that far more people would be violent if we didn't have access to good antidepressants. And I say that from a very personal place of knowing what it's like with loved ones who have their medication and don't, okay? So I thank God that we live in a time where we have those, and I think what we need to do is we need to, number one, destigmatize mental illness in our nation. It's just illness. It's an illness of the chemicals of your brain. We need a vastly higher number of psychiatrists. I can tell you that in 15 years of pastoring, I sent people to psychiatrists who were suffering from depression, who were suffering from all kinds of challenges. And getting into a psychiatrist is, number one, incredibly expensive. Number two, difficult at best, months of lead time, because there's simply not enough of them. Because to be a psychiatrist, you got to go be an MD and then do a postdoc in brain chemistry. And so it's just hard, and not too many do. We need to change that. We need more access to mental health care in an inpatient and a residential patient and an intensive outpatient basis. Again, I have intense personal experience with this stuff, guys, in my immediate family. And the number of adolescent inpatient beds in my town in Phoenix, Arizona is ridiculously inadequate. We waited 10 days once in holding, basically, waiting for an inpatient mental health bed to open up for needed help for a family member. And that we see stories like that all over the place. This is doubly so for special needs kids who, again, might be on the autism spectrum, might have known brain disorders or developmental disorders, mood disorders, those kinds of things. It's not well understood in the U.S., and it's not going to get well understood until we start really investing time and money into it, where we really start investing our care into it, where we recognize the fact that, thank God, physical illness, we have done a lot to prevent, to change, to gain new information, and to invest in it, and we need to do the same for mental health care. We're just not, and people slip through the cracks, and thankfully most of them don't slip through the cracks in this way. But I know a lot of people who live under a bridge, veterans who can't get mental health care. The list goes on, and then every once in a while a guy like this pops up. And yes, the FBI failed, and whoever's responsible for that should pay for their failure, their utter failure in their public trust. And yes, could somebody have done something? Well, to see something, say something, worked and then failed. And so, man, there aren't any easy answers here. I don't think taking guns away from all the other people is a good solution. I don't think that legislation banning AR-15s will make any difference at all, because they'll just find another means within the law. We see it happen all the time. Or they'll work outside the law. We see that happen all the time. I do think that we should look at schools and say, wait a minute, there was apparently some unarmed security at the school, but I don't see any reports of an armed presence on campus. I think we should change that. I think across the nation, our teachers should be able to perhaps take another class, a certification like the Federal Air Marshals or the Armed Pilot Program, that it's voluntary, it's significant, but it works. And having armed teachers can be a deterrent, because we deter first, then we keep people from having access, right? We deny them access, and then we defend if we have to. And I'm not a big fan of, putting cops on every campus, because it's a cost problem. I'm not even a huge fan of, well, just put a veteran in every campus. I've seen that in a couple places. I personally don't think that'd be a great solution. But I do think that allowing good teachers and school administrators and staff members who are highly trained, I'm okay with a 40-hour class, straight up truth. If it was offered, if we could do that, I would offer the class to any educator in my place for free. I would teach it for free. I would do it as a public good to teach every educator, every school administrator how to effectively and functionally use a firearm to protect our children. And I guarantee you this, I could find one in every state who would do it with me. Now, of course, some guys are going to get freaked out at me because they're like, dude, we got to pay our bills too. I understand. I wouldn't say I'd do it all the time. I wouldn't do 50 classes a year. But I'd teach every educator who wanted to learn. I'd teach them 40, 50, 60, 80 hours of firearms instruction if it'd keep our kids safe. I think that deterrence would help. I think thinking about physical site security and denying access to those who don't belong, so that they're outside the school and they don't get inside the school, I think we need to look at that. And then being able to defend. I think that having people who are willing to will be a deterrent to these kind of events. And that's kind of what I think right now, guys. Mental health care is a huge problem. Having the ability for good teachers to defend, like they do in places like Israel, I think makes sense. Having the ability to have frank discussions, because I just don't think legislation banning a firearm type is going to help us. And so if I thought it would, I'd talk about it, but I just don't think it is. However, recognize that we're all after the same thing. We're all after preventing the next one. We're all after stopping, if it does happen, about our children going to school and being safe. So those are my thoughts. Remember, as you comment, respectfulness matters, and being respectful of those on all sides of this debate do matter. We will moderate comments according to the community guidelines, and as we grieve, let's grieve with hope. I will say finally that spiritual fitness is the answer here. I think that all of us should remember that we need to say everything we need to say to our loved ones every day. Never leave anything unsaid to your loved ones. And make sure your relationship with Jesus is strong, because you don't know before that day is going to come. And you don't want to come to that day, to that moment, and not have your spiritual fitness strong. I also think, for me personally, having my spiritual fitness strong gives me the ability to act knowing that if it is my last day, that I'm okay, that my family knows I love them, that I'll see Jesus and it'll be all right. So, guys, let's talk about this one respectfully. Let's talk about it kindly. Let's love on each other well, and let's move forward and grieve together.